Welcome back to the Cruise Elite Podcast. What's up, Tony?
Good morning, Taylor. I'm excited about our episode today, but I wanted to talk briefly about some training stuff.
Yeah.
You know, we talked about some strength training philosophy with Cruise Elite, and just kind of through our conversations, I've been picking up little things. But the other day, after doing some club work, I got some of these Indian clubs. They're
right.
like,
You texted me the
I
photo.
sent you the picture, right?
Yep.
They're like proper Indian gadas, so they're like wooden, and they're not like just bowling pins. They have like a mace kind of ball end. And
I was laughing when you said you're a sucker for what did you say? You're a sucker for craftsmanship.
Oh yeah, they just look awesome
because they just like look awesome. Man, there was so much detail to those things.
Yeah. So I've been using those, which is something I've never really used in my training before, and that's been really fun. And then I think I saw like one of your Instagram posts where you were basically just kind of like rolling on your like the top of your back from side to side.
Yep.
And I've just been like rolling around on my mats. And I was just thinking to myself, I was like, man, my training looks really different now.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. People ask me about the clubs all the time.
Yeah.
Man, it looks like such a foreign tool to most people. And they literally call them like, they're like, where do you get those bats or those bowling pins?
Yeah, they look like bowling pins, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Just for our listeners, it's it looks like a bat or a bowling pin. You hold it in your hand and it's weighted. But like the ones that are generally called Indian clubs are on the lighter end. Maybe I think I have a pair that's as light as 1.5 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have my other wooden ones are up to 3 pounds. What did you say yours was? Because it's wooden.
Yeah, mine are like 2.5, 2.8 pounds.
Yep. And that's great for like coordination and, basic mobility and stuff. And then I also have steel clubs, which are awesome. I feel like it's my favorite. It's at least in my top 3 favorite training tools. And those are on the heavier end. So I have those from 5 pounds up to 20. Actually,
wow.
no, sorry. 40, 45. I've got a big one. So
okay, so you're doing two-handed work with that though, right?
Yeah, mostly. So the big 45er that I have is like mostly all two-handed. I've tried to do a couple things with one hand, like just basic like swinging it and catching it, and man, it's hard. But yeah, it's a fun tool and there's a lot of value to those.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I mean, even at 2.5 pounds, 3 pounds,
Yep.
I do feel like I'm getting some hypertrophy, or at least it feels like it, because I'm just getting so much more work in my forearms and my hands, and even like the long head of the bicep, just manipulating these things.
Oh yeah, exactly. It's a very, very different kind of load.
Yeah, the leverage is all the way out at the end. I mean, when you think about like traditional strength training with a barbell or a dumbbell, it's like you are getting like right under the weight and you're using your whole body to lift it, or like, your whole limb or whatever it is, where this is like, it's like holding the weight all the way out and then extending it another 2 feet. And the leverage is just totally different.
Totally. So, and you get to move them fast if you want to move them fast. And that's a totally different load versus like more traditional strength training that it's generally very slow.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of cool stuff. Just great tool to bring coordination into your training. And so you're doing a bunch of rolling too. That's great.
Yeah. I'm just rolling around like a madman, like just kind of like forward rolls on either shoulder.
Yeah.
And then I was approximating whatever I saw you doing with the kind of like more sideways roll.
Yeah. Those are like similar like inversions that you would see in jiu-jitsu. Yep.
Yeah, when I was flirting with jiu-jitsu, I had done some of those types of rolls, and yeah, it's just something that most people don't do.
Yeah, and there's good mobility and strength work for the midline to come from that, and then it's also vestibular stimulus.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very cool. Nice. I'm glad you're doing that.
So here I am, doing weird things and then being like, well, that's vestibular training, and like nerding out.
Yeah.
I have one more story about clubs before we move on, but
sure.
Years ago, I got my buddy who's a trainer some Indian clubs, and I got like the lightest metal ones, which were 5 pounds.
Yeah.
And that's if you've never used clubs
They'll
before.
absolutely smoke you. Yeah.
And he worked at a nice gym in New York, like tons of trainers, like really, really kind of one of those high-end gyms. And he brought them in one day and everyone was like, oh, like, let me try that. And like, he was telling people like, oh, like, be careful. Like, you're not, it's just five. He's like, how much is it? 5 pounds. And it's like, and the trainers were always like, oh yeah, of course. Like, don't worry about it. And like one after the other, they'd like grab it and then be like, I think I tweaked something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just like hilarious that by the end of the day, he was like, I think every single personal trainer that like wanted to try it was like, oh shit. Like, I think I just did something.
Yeah.
Use caution.
It's hard to use them. Like, I think one of the reasons they're not a super popular tool is because you literally have to invest time into developing the skill to use them. It's not like a dumbbell where it's like, hey, just hold this and, press it, row it, curl it, whatever. You got to really invest some time into it. And as you may have already learned, you might bonk yourself in the head occasionally. It's just part of it.
Yeah, I've done that. And then I've also dropped one already because I was just like, tossing it in the air and twirling it and like grabbing it. So it'd be like inverted and then tossing it. So it'd be like straight. I'm just in like a exploratory phase with it.
That's cool.
Just watching YouTube videos and stuff. But
nice. Yeah. Glad to hear it. Hey, before we get going, let me give you some exciting news. So the podcast is kicking butt right now.
Yes.
And there's a lot of new listeners. So we've got like 6 times the listeners right now on average, like people who are consistently downloading, 6 times the listeners compared to this time last year.
That's amazing.
So yeah, things are moving along. Amazing. And yeah, thank you everybody out there who's starting to download the episodes and get into what we're offering here. It's exciting. We've had our heads down working on this for a bit now, and getting a podcast going is a very difficult thing, super competitive, platform. And man, our podcast now is getting more downloads and listens than our stuff over on YouTube, which I didn't think was going to be the case anytime soon.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating because with YouTube, you have several advantages, right? Like you can actually demonstrate these techniques, like people could see what's going on.
Right.
But yeah, I think, I'm obviously a podcast producer, so I'm biased. Yeah. But I think that people are craving substance and detail that they're not getting from scrolling on social media.
So true.
From clickbait articles that say like 10 best ways to achieve this, So
true.
I think for all the information we have, like the attention economy is geared towards shallow, and podcasts inherently are deep.
That's a great point. I mean, I feel like my feeling on this right now is that people are getting annoyed now with short form content.
Yeah.
Because there's just so much of it, right? And you're just inundated all day long with it. So yeah, it makes great sense. And yeah, I'm glad that people are excited about our podcast now.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I'm also appreciative of is you've been posting ahead of time some of these episodes. You're like, hey, we're going to talk about hypermobility.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about gait. And you send that to me so I can look at the questions too. And it's really awesome to see what people are thinking about, what they want to know. And so I just wanted to thank everybody that's been commenting and posting about the podcast. That's really great for us to kind of get a pulse on what gaps we need to fill and like what topics we need to hit,
Yeah, 100%. It is great to see where people's minds are with this stuff.
Yeah. So you did a post on today's topic, which is all about gait.
Yes.
And I've been super intrigued by it because you've mentioned it in your own training. You're like, oh yeah, everything I do is about optimizing gait. And I was like, let me earmark that because that seems important. And you've brought it up when you're talking about like taking histories, you're like, yeah, I'm getting information, but a lot of times I'm also looking at how they carry themselves with their posture, how they're walking. That's giving me clues. And so I thought it would be a great idea to do an episode on gait.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in the questions that we got, a lot of people were talking about running gait, which is,
right,
I think, a totally understandable thing to do. But, it sounds like you're not talking about running gait so much as something else. So I thought maybe the best place to start would be to talk about that, and in that way kind of define what we mean when we talk about gait.
Sure.
In an applied neurology context.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So yeah, running gait and walking gait, right? Two different things. And what we're really going to spend our time zooming in on, at least for this episode, is mostly walking gait. And the reason why I want to do that is because part of what I want to share with people is some of our assessment process for understanding the health of a person's brain and their function. And we do that by evaluating walking gait. And some of those things can cross over into evaluating running gait. But running gait is really kind of its own thing, right? It's still important, right? But walking gait is typically what we want to use as an assessment to understand a lot of the key details that we can learn in terms of a person's neurologic function. So, yeah, there was a lot of like technical questions that came in about running gait and like very specific joint positions and things like that. This podcast won't be talking about like running technique and running gait, but instead we're going to be looking at, what kind of gait or what signs in a person's walking gait can kind of give us clues about what types of training might be appropriate for them and what types of drills we might construct to help them with possible underperforming systems in terms of their neurology.
Mm-hmm. My intuition is that, you see someone favoring a side or holding their posture in an asymmetrical fashion, that you can immediately say, hey, maybe there's something vestibular going on there, or maybe there's something vision related going on there.
Right.
Like you might be looking at higher order systems from that. And my suspicion is with running, while that may also be true, that it's more of a skill. And in order to run well, people work on their technique. And so maybe that's not a great assessment tool for Gen Pop. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Actually, I think that's spot on. I mean, definitely running is going to get more into the, there's going to be a lot more skill that goes into that. As far as like walking gait goes, one of the reasons why it's such a useful assessment process for us is because it's completely reflexive coming from those higher order systems that, like you just mentioned, right? You don't have to think about walking, right? It's not like, okay, right leg, left leg, left leg. Doesn't work like that, right? It's completely reflexive. And so it's a very useful assessment process for us because different postures that we hold, the way that we move, the way that our limbs move or don't move, things that our head is doing, there's so much that goes into it. We'll talk about all those things today. You can get some really, really good insight into what is going on with a person neurologically. And what's going on with them neurologically it impacts the movement output that you're looking at, which is their walking. So it's a very high level kind of assessment process. And honestly, it's a lifetime of learning that goes into assessing gait because every single gait that you see is different. Gait is like personality, right? Because there's so many different systems that are working together to create a person's gait cycle. And so just like every person that is uniquely different, every single person's walking gait is uniquely different. Maybe not to somebody who's not aware of this yet or doesn't have a trained eye for it. Walking might just look like walking. But when you start to really zoom in on things and you learn what key things to actually observe, all of a sudden everybody's walking gait looks different. And then all of a sudden people watching gets even more fun.
That's so fascinating. I mean, because from my vantage point, I'm remembering your story when you first started working with Rodenko. And he told you, he was like, hey, you need to watch how everybody walks.
I was literally just thinking of that.
And I'm putting myself in your shoes there, and I'm like, I wouldn't even know what to look for. I mean, other than like the couple things that I said earlier, like, oh, maybe they're asymmetrical in some way.
Yeah.
Maybe, their posture is slouched or something. But other than that, like, what is that? What else do I know?
I mean, at that point in my life, dude, like I'd be slightly embarrassed to tell him this, but like I was pretending. Like I was like, all right, Igor wants me to watch this person walk. At the time when I was working alongside Igor, we worked in this area that had a pool for the pool exercises, and then next door was this big basketball court. And it was a very old building. It had this old school feel to it, and it was part of a veterans hospital. And so it was like this huge, like old cement building with no windows. It was had actually had a cool training vibe to it. But yeah, I would do like initial assessments and stuff with clients, and I didn't have any gait education. And so when Igor was like, you should be watching all of your clients walk, I basically would just have them walk down the basketball court and pretend. I'm like, well, so
looks good.
I'm
One foot in
supposed to-
front
yeah.
of the other.
Yes, exactly. Arms look like they're swinging, and yeah, I mean, I was like, in my mind, I was like, well, I guess over time I might learn something about this. But yeah, that's where it all started for me. And Igor used to say, your gait and your posture is your signature. And there was a lot of I think there was a lot of meaning behind that. And I didn't necessarily know what it was, but it was very intriguing to me because I saw Igor evaluating his clients and their walking, and I knew that he was taking it very seriously. So I'm like, man, what kind of information is he downloading? Because I don't see it yet. My eye can't see that yet. And I lacked the education, of course, because, you don't learn anything about, walking gait just coming out of college, right? This is something you have to pursue in your own continued education. Right. And so, yeah, I did, but, it wasn't until, 15 years later that I started getting better exposure to using walking gait as an assessment. And I started getting this through different forms of continuing education. And honestly, most of them were pretty lousy. Like now that looking back on it, compared to what I have now in terms of the information that I really like and the stuff that I use, most of it was pretty lousy. And what you generally see when you're learning about gait is that there's a couple different ways to look at it. Most people look at gait in a very biomechanical way. And so they're looking at all the little mechanics that go into gait, and it's a very complicated process. And because everybody's gait is different, it can really cause you to hyper-focus on all these little nuances. And in the end, it's very difficult to make a whole lot of sense out of it. And there are people that claim they're master. So in our industry, right, whenever you look at something complicated like movement, okay, because it's complicated, especially when you start looking at gait, there's a lot of people out there claiming to be masters. And what they do is, this is very typical. When you claim to be a master at something involving movement, you also develop your own language to go with it so that no one else can really understand it. Right. And so now you really look like a master because you're using a language that nobody else can really understand. And then some people, get drawn into that and they're like, well, I don't understand anything this person's saying, but it sounds sophisticated. So I'd better go and learn this. And that always bothered me because I was trying to, get more education on this, but then I found myself kind of in a rabbit hole where the nuances became so detailed and the words became completely new and nobody else was using the same language. And the way that they might approach it with the testing, it always ended up being another rabbit hole and it never really made sense. So that was very discouraging. And later on in this continued education process, when I got into more neuro and I started taking Z courses and just really getting into the good stuff, I was exposed to a couple of other kinds of gait assessment. One of them being what is called more of a neurologic gait assessment. So there's the biomechanical kinds of gait assessments, and it seems like everybody has their own idea of what that is. And then there's a neurologic gait assessment, which very few people are actually utilizing. And it is fantastic because instead of looking at an unlimited amount of little nuances that could go into biomechanics, we get to zoom in on some very important key features of gait that are directly connected to certain brain areas. And it is also very challenging. Like it's a hard thing to learn, but it is very learnable if you put your time in, and it is absolutely just fantastic as an assessment tool. It's something that I love to use.
Yeah. So let's get in a time machine and go back to the studio you were working at with Igor Burdenko.
Mm-hmm.
And you have, 5 minutes with yourself, 10 minutes with yourself from back then to explain neurological gait and how to assess it. How would you approach that?
Well, first, I'd have to tell my former self there, my early self, that, I have to give some very fast education about how movement comes from the brain and the nervous system.
Right.
Right. Because at that point, I'm not even thinking like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I'm thinking movement comes from your muscles. But that's the only level that I was thinking at. That's one of the levels, but there's a lot more. Right.
Yeah.
So I kind of have to start there. But to jump into like neurogate, there's 4 things that we really want to zoom in on. Okay. And I'll just list them all and then we can kind of pick it apart a little bit. So the first one is called a bobblehead. All right. And that's just basically what it sounds like. Like when you're walking, does your head bobble? Okay. We'll come back to it. The second thing is a loss of arm swing. Okay. And there was actually quite a few questions that I noticed that people were asking about arm swing. The third one is what we call a PMRF pattern. If you've gotten into any of the material on this podcast, we once in a while say this really fancy thing, pontomedullary reticular formation. And that is essentially the brainstem. Okay. So there is what is looked at as a PMRF pattern during walking gait. And the last one is a cerebellar pattern. We've also talked about the cerebellum and its important role in movement. Okay, so we've got bobblehead, loss of arm swing, PMRF pattern, and a cerebellar pattern. Okay, so those are the things that I would be presenting to myself, right? If we use that time machine.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the things that you have to learn how to identify, because once you can identify those patterns, it helps you with your exercise and drill selection, which is awesome because now it's not so much a guessing game. You can reach into your toolbox and start, constructing drills and then using the gait cycle as your reassessment. We talked a lot about reassessment with range of motion. We talked about reassessment with other things. Well, gait is kind of the gold standard in terms of a reassessment.
Fascinating. And like other assessments, when there's a neurological change, the assessment can change instantly as well, correct?
Instantly. And you'll see those changes in gait if you know what you're looking for.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So immediately I'm seeing that while I don't understand what necessarily a cerebellar pattern or a PRMF pattern looks like, immediately it seems actually simpler than, discussing, okay, how's your foot angle on your left side and your right side? How's your shoulder? What happens if your arm swings on one side a little differently? That we had a lot of questions about these very specific sort of positions in gait. And I did want to talk about some of them in this episode, but immediately I'm seeing, okay, there are patterns and maybe a lot of this stuff fits into some of these patterns and you don't need to necessarily zoom into the micro. You can look at the entire movement.
Bingo. And that's why this is so useful. And it's not to say that the biomechanical model of gait assessment is not useful, because it is. But my experience professionally has been that this neurologic gait assessment is far more valuable to me. At least it's a better starting point. And then if I need to work on biomechanics and get into more of the nuances of, proprioception with somebody and how they're walking and what their body position is and all those little details that we could look at, I'll generally be circling back to that. Yep.
Should we define the 4 patterns and just kind of drill down on them?
Yeah, let's do it. And for our listeners, this is this whole gait assessment that we're about to get into here. This is all something that we teach We teach you how to use this gait assessment in the Neuro Dojo. So that's our advanced course. So it's something to look forward to. If you have any previous education on gait assessment, you probably know what I mean when I talk about that biomechanical rabbit hole. Well, this is something that could really, really help you. Something to look forward to if you plan on taking the Neuro Dojo. So this first thing that we look for, called a bobblehead. Okay, that is exactly what it sounds like. Basically, when you observe a bobblehead, and I should say, when we're doing a gait assessment, we generally set it up so that the person is walking away from us. Okay, so the first thing I'm seeing when somebody is doing a gait assessment with me is I'm watching them, their backside, as they walk away from me. And then they get to wherever they're going, I have them turn around and then walk back towards me. Okay, so when that is happening, I will take my attention to their upper body first and their head and their neck to see what it's doing. And when you walk, you should have a stable head, neck, and eyes, right? And we have reflexive systems that do that for us. This is where your visual system comes into play, your vestibular system comes into play. Those systems are largely involved in midline stability, so that when you walk, your head is stable enough that you can keep a clear visual picture as you're moving. So when you see somebody that is expressing a bobblehead, it is extremely subtle in most cases, but what it looks like is a little bit of extra oscillation, if you will, where when they're walking, their head is just bobbling a little bit. Okay, it's just oscillating a little bit, and it's kind of out of rhythm with the rest of the gait process. Like when you heel strike on gait, you have energy that is now, it's entering your body, right? And that force has to be dealt with. And eventually that force will exit. So it enters the heel. We should actually talk about the back force transmission system here for a minute. So when you look at gait, something called a heel strike, that's when your heel is making contact with the ground. Obviously, that strike produces force. That force enters your body. Okay, so that force is going to enter your body through the striking heel, and it's going to travel up the lateral leg. Okay, and it is eventually going to start to cross at the sacrum. So it's now beginning to cross the midline of the body. It then will kind of move through what's called the thoracolumbar fascia. Kind of now it's on the opposite side of the body, still moving up. So now we're around like the lat muscle. And eventually, as this energy continues its way up, it splits. Okay. And some of that energy is going to move across the arm, and the rest of that energy is going to move up into the neck, head, and jaw. Okay, so this is just how energy is transferring through the body. Starts at the heel upon strike, goes up the leg, across the sacrum. Now it's on the opposite side of the body, continues to ascend, and then splits. Okay, and there's a lot of force involved with that. And if you weren't able to deal with that force appropriately with reflexive stabilization, you can understand how, because that energy is splitting and some of it's going up through the neck, the head, the jaw, that could cause the head to bobble a little bit, being furthest away from the heel strike. So when you see the bobblehead, it's a direct indication that something might be going on with maybe proprioception in the spine, or maybe there's an energy transfer issue. We sometimes say like an energy leak somewhere. But more importantly, the reflexive systems that give us the midline stabilization. So oftentimes what we see with a bobblehead is that the person ends up, and through a testing, you find out that they might have a vision problem or a vestibular problem. And so when I see a bobblehead, I'm already checking the boxes for, okay, well, that means I have to do further evaluation on this person's eyes and inner ear, because there might be something going on there.
Interesting. I was expecting vestibular, but I wasn't expecting vision with that. Namely because it sounds like, you're stabilizing kind of this force that's irradiating through your body, right? And it's going up your leg and around your back and up to your shoulder where it splits, right?
Yep.
I could see how if there's a force moving your neck or head, and your vestibular system has a deficit, that it might like overcompensate or do something that it wouldn't normally do. But with vision, I don't see the connection. Can you draw that line for me?
Yeah, so it's because the visual system is, through its pathways, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very much involved in midline control of the spine, right? So your eyes and your spine intimately related. Basically, wherever you move your eyes, right, that's where the rest of your body is going to go reflexively,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so walking, there's going to be a lot of things that go into that based on the visual system. There's lots of different kinds of, visual skills we could look at for that. But yeah, this would be just reflexive control that's coming from our eyes, because our eyes drive so much of our movement. I mean, think about it. Our eyes are presenting us with the goal for why we're moving in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
That's literally getting from point A to point B as a contralateral biped, right? This is primitive stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Primitive stuff. Like, we're put here to move point A to point B, and most of the motivation to move is coming through our visual system.
Okay.
Yeah.
I could see that, like in a scenario where, let's say there's a visual deficit, and so you're holding your posture in a way that you might not otherwise, because your eyes are giving you different information from side to side, perhaps.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put that.
And then that force hits your neck head area, and the visual system has to compensate. Maybe it's not fast enough, or it has to recalibrate. I'm just trying to
So it's all,
speak it out loud for
yeah, it's
myself more
excellent.
than anything.
Yeah, it's excellent. So this all comes down to creating better input for the brain, right?
Right.
When we think about, like, what do we have to do to train this person now if they have existing vision and vestibular issues? We're seeing that bobblehead. The question then is, well, why is there a reflexive stabilization problem happening? And then we have to look to those systems that are very much involved in creating that stabilization. So it's all about creating better input. Can we create better input, that now is incoming through the visual system or incoming from the inner ear? When we can improve the input, well, guess what? Your body and its neurology already knows how to walk, right? This is a very primitive reflexive thing. So by changing input, I should say by changing the quality of the input, that's when you start seeing improvements in the quality of the output, which in this case is walking.
Totally. Thank you for clarifying that. With the bobblehead, is it generally side to side, front to back? Is it fast, like in jerky? Is it kind of slow and lumbering?
It's super subtle. It's sort of all over the place.
Okay.
I've seen it side to side, but I also see it in kind of a circular, oscillating, kind of all over the place look to it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now here's the other thing to mention. So what's the opposite of a bobblehead, right? It's basically a rigid, immobile neck. Okay. So sometimes we actually see this go the extreme the other way, because your body's correction for an unstable head is to increase muscle tone and create a very tight neck. So this would be like a stability strategy. So sometimes what we see is, the person can have a bobblehead, but if your brain is trying really, really hard to correct that, because imagine how threatening it is to have a bobblehead, that's going to deteriorate all the input, all the incoming input coming in through your eyes, and make moving through the world more threatening. So it's a very high priority thing for your brain to want to stabilize that. And that's when we start to see people with kind of the exact opposite, which we still like. This is all still under the umbrella of bobblehead.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have that extreme rigidity in the neck, which looks like a very tight neck and the head has no movement, and you'll generally see that these people have a hard time separating head from body. So for example, if I'm watching somebody walk, I have them walk all the way down to wherever, they're going to walk, and then I have them turn around. Somebody that is moving more efficiently and doesn't have a very rigid neck will generally turn their eyes first, their head and neck will follow, and then the rest of the body will follow. And of course, this all happens at once, so it's not like methodical, but you can see separation in the head and the body. And people that have a very rigid neck generally are kind of, their midline becomes all one piece.
Right.
And so when they go to turn around, their head and their body are merged together.
It's almost like an invisible neck brace. Like
Yep.
you see them
Yep.
turn their whole body.
Exactly. And they usually are telling you that they have neck pain, and you're able to kind of clearly see why when you start to see them walk if they're struggling there. So that's the bobblehead. And depending on, no matter which of the kind of extremes there that you see, a very large part of the answer is usually always within training the eyes and the inner ear.
Yeah. So you would notice bobblehead in a gait assessment, and then you would follow up with some more specific assessments and say, okay, let's look at your visual system, let's look at your vestibular system, and drill down and try to find it there.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd probably immediately want to look at some gaze stabilization, which is just holding your eyes on a target. Are your eyes stable? We might look at VORs, which is keeping your eyes on a target while your head's moving. We might look at smooth pursuits, which is tracking of a target, or visual saccades, which is like faster eye movements from one point to another. So we have kind of a whole battery of tests that we might use for the vision and vestibular system, and seeing that bobblehead will kind of tip us off to using some of those assessments to learn more about the person.
Yeah, that's great. Loss of arm swing. Did you ever watch Seinfeld?
A little bit.
You know how there's always there's characters, and they always have a thing about them, like this guy's a loud talker, or like this guy's there's one character, I think it's Molly Shannon from SNL plays this character, but she doesn't swing her arms. And it's like the topic of conversation throughout this episode. Anyways, it's a fantastic episode. It's the first thing I thought of when you said loss of arm swing, was like seeing Molly Shannon and Seinfeld just walking with no arms at all.
That's funny. One of the comments that came in on Instagram when we put up that post was that somebody said their family members make fun of them for having what they call T-Rex arms when she runs.
Yeah, I saw that one.
Yeah, and I was kind of visualizing, like, what does this person mean? And then I'm kind of visualizing that, and I'm like, oh, I get it. They probably have no arm swing, and so they're flexed at their elbows.
Yeah.
Right? Looking like a T-Rex. And that's actually a perfect visual for maybe, what might be a loss of arm swing in a more extreme context.
Yeah. So tell us about that. I mean, that one to me seems kind of obvious that you would see it, but is it like they're completely immobile, or is it sometimes just less swing?
Yeah, sometimes you'd be surprised. So you watch somebody walk, and they literally might have one arm that basically is not swinging at all, or even both arms. I've seen that many times. In a healthier population, what you see is limited swing, right? It's reduced arm swing. And what that would look like is, rather than the arm swing coming predominantly from the shoulder, and this is not a lot of arm swing, because when you think about walking just kind of at a normal pace, it's not like your arms are swinging wildly, but there is, this pendulum action happening of the arm just reflexively. And most of that pendulum action should come from the shoulder. What we typically see when somebody is not swinging their arm from the shoulder is that a lot of that swing tries to come from the elbow. So sometimes you see what we call like elbow arm swing, where they're basically just flexing their elbows like they're doing bicep curls, and there's no swing coming from the shoulder. So yeah, it can be a total loss of arm swing, or very limited. And then other times people kind of compensate for the limited arm swing with the T-Rex arms.
Yeah. So from a biomechanical perspective, it feels like the arm swing's such a natural part of walking. What is that telling you that's not there? So
arm swing is coming from reflexive circuitry as well. So when we see reduced arm swing, we immediately start to think about the opposite cortex. So if I have limited right arm swing, okay, then if I was evaluating somebody that had limited right arm swing, I'm going to write myself a little note about looking at their left hemisphere and doing whatever kinds of assessments we might have to tell us more information about their left cortex. There's circuitry there that is involved in reflexive arm swing that eventually, crosses the midline into that opposite hemisphere. The frontal lobe is probably where I would be starting to think about first, right? If I saw limited arm swing. And one of the easy training solutions for this, it's great when things are simple like this, but it's kind of an ipsilateral approach, meaning if you see limited, at least at the beginning, when you see limited arm swing on the right, we actually would try right-sided mobility drills for in this case, maybe the right arm. By improving proprioception, perhaps we start to get better arm swing. But remember, when we move the right side of our body, we're stimulating the left cortex. So right-sided movement in this case becomes, our delivery system for better input to the left cortex. And sometimes it can be that simple in terms of improving that reflexive arm swing. However, there's other pathways that matter here too. One of them is very much connected to the visual system. There's an area in going back to the brainstem, there's an area at the top of the brainstem called the midbrain, and there's some circuitry or pathways there that cross it that are involved in the reflexive arm swing process, particularly the control of the anterior muscles of the shoulder and even into the bicep for arm swing. And so this is this is why it's so cool to learn neuro. Did you see the video I put up the other day on Instagram where I did a vision drill? And it was like gaze stabilizing by looking at a target to your right and just looking at it, holding your eyes there for 10 seconds. And then on the left side of your body, I had him do like a really simple coordination task. Did you get
I missed that.
Oh, okay. So this post went insane. I mean, millions of views on this thing. You should see the comments. If you get a chance, you'll enjoy seeing them. I mean, people are, the long-standing pain issues are going from 9 out of 10 pain issues with shoulder impingements. And, I've seen 10 doctors, nobody can help me. I've done years of physio, no one can help me. I did your drill once, the pain's gone. I mean, it's a common answer on this post.
That's so cool.
And I'm getting DMs now too from people that are like, what does it mean if I did the drill once and my pain never came back?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's wild. And I'm like, it means you got lucky. Like, that's great. Like, if it doesn't work out.
Imagine though? That's so incredible. I just tried this random reel on Instagram and
I mean, crazy. Yeah. And that is there's tons of that on there. And so when I create these drills for Instagram, I'm literally I was creating that when Alicia and I were eating lunch. We were outside eating lunch. And we're like, we need to post on Instagram. And I'm like, what can I do? It would be a fun little vision drill, maybe a stacked drill that might help somebody with anterior shoulder pain. Because I already know people's complaints because they DM me their complaints all day.
Yeah.
So I already know the parts of people's bodies that are giving them the most problems. And so I was like, let's try to solve some anterior shoulder pain. So I'm thinking about pathways when I do that. And so I'm creating a drill and the reason I'm mentioning this now is that particular drill that I created would be a very strong activation for that pathway in that area in the midbrain, as well as the opposite cortex, which is involved in reflexive arm swing and controlling that anterior shoulder musculature. So I created a drill that would affect muscle tone for the anterior shoulder. And so all these people with anterior shoulder pain tried it and got an amazing response from it. That's the cool stuff you can do when you know pathways.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, there's people on there. They're like, this is the placebo effect. This is what's the other term that's really popular to say now? I can't think of it. Basically, you're telling somebody this is going to help their shoulder pain, so therefore it does. You know what I mean? Like, I forget what the patient something. Yeah, something suggestive, something like that. So of course you get that too. It's like, well, if I could just suggest people into these results, that would be really amazing. It doesn't exactly work like that when you work with people. You learn what areas of the body people are complaining about most, and then you start getting experience with understanding pathways and structures and where these areas of the body get their reflexive control from.
Mm-hmm.
See, this is the difference. This is what separates the neuro coach from the therapist or trainer or coach who's doing all voluntary work, right? So remember, we fixed people's shoulders with this drill, or I shouldn't say we, they did it. I guided it, but they fixed their shoulder with that drill without ever doing anything for their shoulder. That's what I'm talking about when I mean reflexive. The other way of approaching that would be, well, let's work with the shoulder. Let's do shoulder exercises. And that doesn't always work because you're using voluntary types of inputs that don't necessarily affect all the reflexive structures that go into movement there. That's often why we bring in the eyes. That's often why we bring in the vestibular system, because these systems are so intimately involved in the reflexive muscle tone. When you know your pathways, where they go, and which types of movements they help control, now you have an unlimited, tool set, right? You can start to build drills that do the things you want them to do. It's so fun. It's just such a cool way to approach it.
Yeah, and not at all intuitive to someone that hasn't studied
Totally.
applied neurology.
Oh yeah, I'm a total whack job to people on Instagram, like that don't know, like the people that don't care to know.
Yeah,
they're just like they won't try it. They don't care to know. Like, yeah, I'm a total alien to them. And I love it because I actually know why I'm doing the stuff I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not like coming up with a new language to try to go with it. It's like, no, this is legit applied neurology based on what we know currently through neuroscience. It's so fun.
And to our earlier comments about the podcast, this is why these conversations are so valuable, because on Instagram, someone just sees it and they're like, oh yeah, he's a whack job,
Exactly.
like whatever.
Yeah.
Whereas, we actually have a whole episode and I really appreciate your good spirit on this episode where I was like, we need to talk about the placebo effect. And it was one of the earlier episodes that we did together.
Yeah.
If you want to go back and listen to that, I think that's a really cool discussion as well. But yeah, you have to address it because people are going to be skeptical.
Totally. A viewer of my content, they just jump to conclusions, and they probably are like, oh, this guy just is making stuff up in his little home gym there and putting it out on Instagram. They don't realize that, like, I spent 15 years all day for 15 years studying, talking about, reading about neuro.
Yeah.
That's literally like, that's where it comes from. It's not, hey, let me do this, and make something up and hope it's useful. It's like, no, I'm actually making it up based on stuff I've learned and just through experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Case in point, arm swing, muscle tone in your shoulders,
Yes.
the midbrain, like you can draw that line just from watching someone walk.
Yep, exactly. And the starting point there, as I mentioned at the very beginning, would be same side movement.
Mm-hmm.
So movement drills, like our complex nonlinear style mobility drills on that arm, might actually be a good driver for better reflexive arm swing. From there, the next step would be the visual system. I'll throw you a hint and just say convergence skills, like our exercise we like, the pencil push-ups.
My personal favorite.
Yeah, that would be a next best step to explore how the visual system might impact reflexive arm swing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the PMRF pattern.
Yes, the pontomedullary reticular formation.
I'll never remember that.
Such a fancy one. Sounds so fun to say. So PMRF pattern. Okay, this gets fun. This gets tougher. Okay. With the PMRF pattern, you can have what we would either look at as an upper body PMRF pattern or a lower body PMRF pattern. Of course, you can have both too. You can have this on one side of the body, or you can have it on both sides of the body. So there's a lot of possibilities to this one. But here's what it looks like. And this is, I want our listeners to be thinking about essentially the type of posture that is happening with movement. So this is dynamic posture. Okay. The brainstem, which is what we're talking about when we say PMRF, is largely involved in posture. So think calibrating muscle tone to help you maintain posture against gravity. Okay. And so this is dynamic posture because we're moving. Okay. So when we observe a PMRF pattern, which by the way, the reason we're observing a PMRF pattern or looking for signs of it is that it's a direct window into the health of the brain stem, because we want to make sure the brain stem is doing its job most appropriately, most optimally. And when it's not, we can sometimes see that in a walking gait. So here's what it looks like. When you're walking or when you're watching somebody walk away from you, I will generally either kind of zoom in on like the upper body first. It's weird. It's sort of like after years of assessing gait, you follow your attention, right? And so when I first started learning this, I'm like, okay, I'm going to look at the upper body first, and then I'm going to look at the lower body next. Now I kind of find that I just follow my attention, and I'm not sure where I'm going to pick up on it, and then I just, do. So with the upper body, what you would generally see as somebody is walking away from you is that you're going to see a lot of or most of the palm of their hand. Okay. Which means if you think about the limb itself, think about the arm, in order to see somebody's palm, their arm would have to be internally rotated. Right. If it's not, right, then their hand is bladed during the walking process, right? You won't see their palm. You just see kind of the back of their pinky finger. Their thumb is pointed forward. So this posture is an internally rotated arm so that you see some of or sometimes all of their palm as they're walking away from you. That internal rotation is coming from a couple different places. It's coming from the shoulder. Okay, so internal rotation at the shoulder, but it's also coming from the elbow. Sometimes in the case that it's a little bit more obvious, you'll get some internal rotation of the forearm. Okay, so the pronation of the forearm. And you'll also see sometimes some excessive, or I just call it increased, flexor tone. So this all of a sudden becomes the claw hand to some degree, with internal rotation coming from the shoulder and the elbow. So when you see this in somebody's upper body, that's what it looks like. It looks like kind of a claw hand. It can be subtle or it can be not so subtle. It can be on one arm or it can be on both arms. So this is something that next time you're at your local park, out for a walk, you're at the airport, grocery store, you're people watching, look for how many people have this posture.
Yeah.
A lot of people have this posture. A lot of people. So that's the upper body. Now, I guess let me talk about why that's happening. So the brainstem being largely involved in muscle tone, one of its jobs during walking is to facilitate certain compartments of muscles, so like groupings of muscles, and inhibit other groupings of muscles, right? This is what is known as like the balance of muscle tone, right? Like all movement is this combination of flexor and extensor synergies, right? So when we locomote, right, like humans on two legs, we've got flexor activity happening. We've got extensor activity happening. We have circuitry that helps us facilitate the stuff that's needed when it's needed and inhibit the other stuff that's not needed in the moment. And that's this act of balancing muscle tone. That's how we're able to move, right? You take all this stuff for granted, but when you reach out and grab your glass of water, what allows you to let go, right? That's muscle tone created in flexion to hold something, but what allows you to actually make the decision to let go, which honestly really isn't a decision, is it? It's very reflexive at this point. You just let go. So that's facilitating flexor tone to grab the cup, right? And then inhibiting some of the extensor tone, right? Because if the extensor tone was not inhibited properly, you'd have a tug of war against yourself.
Right.
And that's what it is to actually have very poor neural control. People who don't move well, or they've suffered some kind of unfortunate brain injury or something, and they develop PMRF issues like that are relatively serious. One of the things that sometimes happens there is the balance of muscle tone gets very confused,
Yeah.
and they might not be able to inhibit certain musculature to allow them to move efficiently. So movement gets very difficult. It becomes a tug of war. You're fighting yourself. This can happen after more serious injuries like that, but it can also happen at the more subtle level with a generally healthy population, but it might not be something that you're super aware of.
Yeah. Oh, it's just a tight muscle,
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So when we look at the neurology of the brainstem, the PMRF, and right now we're focused in on the upper body, when the PMRF is doing its job appropriately during walking or just even at rest, it is to some degree inhibiting the flexor muscles above T6, so above thoracic 6. So if you were to think about drawing a horizontal dividing line across the body, kind
Mm-hmm.
of at, I don't know, let's call it the margin of the ribs up kind of by the sternum. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Think about an imaginary dividing line there that's separating now upper from lower. Okay. Above that line, above that T6 line, that's going to be our approximate dividing line. If the PMRF is doing its job appropriately, it will reflexively inhibit the flexors above T6. So that means, like, think about like your pec muscles.
Mm-hmm.
Think about like the bicep, the anterior shoulder. Okay. And it will facilitate some extensor tone above that T6 area too. So we're starting to see the postural influence here. So that means somebody with a PMRF posture that's suffering from tight pecs, where the shoulders rolled in, maybe they're
Mm-hmm.
tight biceps, repetitive bicep tendon pain and issues, right? This also could be a PMRF issue if it's not doing its job properly. That means that flexor tone is not being inhibited properly.
Yeah. You know what I'm thinking of when you're
Mm-hmm.
describing this posture?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of the nerve glides that we did
Mm-hmm.
with your arm, and basically all of those points, like your shoulders up, you're
Yeah.
internally rotated, like that's how
Oh,
you
the
the
slacking
slacking,
version.
yeah.
Yes,
The
yes, that's right.
slacking of the arm
I think,
nerves.
yeah, I think we had done like I forget if it was median nerve or something, but we
Mm-hmm.
slacked it. And when you get into that position, yeah, it's very similar. I should say too, because this is one technical detail that goes against what we just mentioned there, is that another part of this upper body PMRF posture is that you will sometimes see that shoulder is drooping. It is depressed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that should make sense as you think about what I just said about if the PMRF's doing its job, it's inhibiting flexors above T6 and facilitating extensors above T6. So if it's not doing its job, that means it's not facilitating extensor muscles very well above T6. And that may express itself as a droopy shoulder because the upper trap muscle does not have the appropriate tone.
Mm-hmm.
So the upper body PMRF posture is this internally rotated limb with possibly a depressed shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
Very common postural issue. Anyone who works with posture will be like, oh yeah, I see that all the time.
Yeah.
All right, so I was going to go into the lower body. Okay, so same idea, right? With a brainstem that needs to be able to inhibit and facilitate appropriate musculature. Okay, with the lower body PMRF posture, the limb will generally be outwardly rotated. Okay, so you'll see the person's, a lot of times the foot will be outwardly rotated. And that's kind of also involving like the hip. There may even be some strange rotations happening at the knee. But generally what you're seeing is the limb is outwardly rotated. When you walk, your feet should be pointed in the direction that you're traveling.
Mm-hmm.
But if you start looking at how people are walking, sometimes people's feet look like they've been in an argument. Somebody said that to me once. They're like, I thought it was the funniest thing ever. You know, like the duck foot walk?
Yeah.
The duck foot walk is what we would call a bilateral PMRF pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you can have this on one side of the body, you can have it on both sides of the body. So what's happening there is similar to what we talked about with the upper body, but now we're below T6, or so that imaginary dividing line. So if the PMRF is doing its job properly, it is inhibiting musculature, extensor musculature below T6, and it is facilitating musculature, flexor musculature below T6. So what does this sound like? Well, let's think of some common muscles, glutes and hip flexors, maybe hip rotators too. So if you happen to have a lower body PMRF pattern, sometimes what we see is, those folks have essentially glutes and hip rotators and maybe even glute meads that are not being inhibited appropriately. And that's causing the limb to outwardly rotate and create that foot out type of posture.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other side of that is possibly their hip flexors, right? Maybe, hip flexor complex, adductor complex is not able to facilitate like it needs to. And so maybe we have a weakening of some of that musculature. Okay, so this is all about balance of muscle tone.
Mm-hmm.
So with a PMRF posture, circling back to the whole thing, you can just see this in the upper body. You can just see this in the lower body, or you can see it in both the upper and the lower. And in many cases, you see it bilaterally. All right. And so there's a lot of different things you can do with that information, because we can target a lot of, or I should say we can direct a lot of our inputs, our training inputs that we use, no matter what system we're talking about: eyes, inner ear, breathing, proprioception, cranial nerves, you name it. We can direct that stuff at the PMRF on purpose to try to get it to do its job better. So let's say I see this pattern in somebody all on the right side, which is relatively common. I can say, all right, we're going to start with some left-sided complex nonlinear movements. Because through the neurology of movement, that voluntary movement that we do on the left side of the body, targeting the left cerebellum, is also going to involve the opposite cortex and the opposite side of the brainstem. So one of the first stages of working on, let's say, a right PMRF pattern, oddly enough, is doing left-sided complex nonlinear movements. And then we can also bring in all the other cool tools like the eyes, the inner ear, and direct cranial nerve stimulation. You've seen me doing the weird stuff on Instagram like tongue circles, right? Tongue circles is a direct cranial nerve stimulation, right? And so that's, as we're piecing together stacked drills, we might be targeting one side of the brainstem for a very specific reason. And then in this case, we'd use Gait as a reassessment to see if anything changed.
One thing that always confuses me is which side of the brain is controlling the body.
Yep.
Because it's opposite except for in the brainstem. Is that right?
So with movement, right, with motor control, if we move the left side of our body, so just let's say we move the left hand, that is going to stimulate the left cerebellum, which I think is where some people get confused when they're learning this.
Yeah.
But it's also going to stimulate and in part come from the opposite cortex. So if I move my left hand, I'm stimulating the right side of the cortex.
Right.
If I move my left hand, I'm stimulating the same side cerebellum.
And the cortex is more voluntary and the cerebellum's more reflexive, or
it's so
we should do an episode on this.
Yes, yeah, for sure. Neurology of movement. Yeah, we teach this constantly in our courses. So the voluntary movement itself, like the decision to make a voluntary movement, is coming from that opposite cortex.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep, exactly. And then what we say is, when you stimulate, in this case, like the right cortex, if it's doing its job properly, it will send a burst of, information. It'll fire down into the same side PMRF, right? Because with the brainstem, you have a right side, you have a left side.
Right.
So that means stimulating the right cortex also will stimulate the right PMRF. That means that stimulating the left cerebellum will also stimulate both the right cortex and the right PMRF. Right. So this is why knowing the neurology of movement is so useful and important, because it's always a two-way street. We can use these different structures to target another structure. Yeah, it's a great simplistic, overly simplified way of looking at it, but it's a very useful one. So if we wanted to also affect PMRF function in someone's gait, complex nonlinear movements on the opposite side to where we're seeing the possible PMRF gait pattern.
Yeah.
Yep. So it's a lot there. It's a lot there. So the cerebellar gait pattern.
Yeah.
This one I think is probably a little bit less to talk about anyway, but there's still a lot here. So again, cerebellar patterns now, we can see them in the upper body. We can see them on one side. We can see them on both sides. We can see it in the lower body. We can see them on one side of the lower body. We can see them on both sides. Here's what it generally looks like. During a walking gait, if you're seeing an upper body cerebellar pattern, you are also going to see a inward rotation of the arm coming from the shoulder. But in most cases, it will be without the PMRF stuff I mentioned, like the forearm pronation to go with it, the flexion of the hand, kind of that additional flexor tone. This is going to be more of an internal rotation coming from the shoulder, and it might also come along with a protraction of the shoulder blade. Okay. So why? Well, one of the big roles of the cerebellum in terms of its muscle tone maintenance responsibilities is to facilitate extensor tone, and it does this in a very proximal way. It's involved in all of it, but it's not as distal as maybe the PMRF is. Okay, so that means we're kind of focused on the musculature around the shoulder region, like the shoulder blade. So think cerebellar pattern, upper body, slight internal rotation coming from the shoulder. Okay. Lower body, same thing. Okay, so lower body, it's an internal rotation, so different from our PMRF pattern. It's an internal rotation, often coming predominantly, again, now from the hip. Okay, so the pigeon walker, right? The person that has both toes pointed inward, maybe has like excessive internal rotation of both femurs. We'd be looking at that as like a bilateral cerebellar pattern in the lower body. And you'll also see this quite commonly in the upper body where maybe both shoulders are inwardly rotated a little bit or both shoulder blades are protracted. Okay. And kind of winged, like a common like postural deficit you hear talked about a lot is like a winging scapula. Okay. That might be part of this too. So yeah, that's your cerebellar pattern.
And it sounds like you can use similar stimulus for the cerebellar pattern because it's so closely connected to the PMRF. Similar inputs.
Yep. First stage tools would be, like we always talk about, complex nonlinear types of movements.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about training the cerebellum is that it's a very easy approach because it's generally ipsilateral. So what that means is if I am expressing a right-sided cerebellar pattern, then right-sided complex nonlinear movements might be the first best choice if we're talking about movement as a tool for that.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it nice and easy. That's why it's the first thing we teach. It's the first form of assessment that we teach in our Neuro Foundations course because it's the easiest application because the first stage of that is ipsilateral. And it's very easy to learn that. It's like, okay, I see the problem. Now I'm going to go target that problem by moving that part of the body. And then we just teach people the style of movement that the cerebellum generally responds best to. See, it's different for the PMRF.
Right.
You can't always work ipsilaterally, and that's why so many people don't get relief from physical therapy. Because the common approach is what I just said before that. The common approach is your shoulder hurts, let's work your shoulder. If you have a PMRF issue that's causing muscle tone imbalances, let's say in your shoulder, and then your only approach is exercising the right shoulder, well, think about the neurology of movement that we just discussed. If I move my right shoulder, I'm stimulating my left brain.
Right.
I'm stimulating now my left PMRF. I'm now activating the wrong PMRF to balance out the muscle tone. So when people take that approach and they happen to have more of a PMRF issue, they further the imbalance, if you want to think about it that way.
Interesting.
And you can get some relief. Don't get me wrong. I mean, this is all very simplified, and we use very simple rules so that we can effectively construct drills that skew activations more to one area of the brain than another.
Great.
So you could do isolated work on that same shoulder and maybe get some relief and maybe get some improvement. But what often happens is, because it's furthering the imbalance, if it's driven or mediated by the PMRF, that's often why that doesn't help. And that's essentially my whole story through my athletic career. I had all right-sided pain, which was a right-sided PMRF finding. And of course, I always tried to do stuff for my pain by moving the stuff that hurt. And it didn't work so well because I was activating the wrong PMRF.
Yeah.
Right? Super, super common. So
this is where opposite joint theory comes into play.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of opposing joints.
Opposing joint.
The PMRF is definitely a part of that, I think.
Yeah.
So the cerebellum is nice and easy in a way, because when you identify the issue, you start with an ipsilateral approach. There's reasons why you would also get into higher order systems, because your eyes are, the cerebellum is largely involved in eye movements, right? So, and that gets way more detailed, because specific movements of the eyes, it's wild, dude. The neurology of eye movement is insane. It's a lifetime of study. Yeah. I mean, if you dive into it, like, there are certain aspects of an eye movement, like the initiation of the movement that's like activating the cerebellum on one side, and then the termination of the eye movement is activating the other cerebellum on the other side, and then the cortical roles and contributions in this stuff and the brainstem. It's vast, right? So when you start getting into using those higher order systems more strategically to direct inputs at either the right or the left cerebellum, it goes beyond just that ipsilateral movement approach. But the cool thing is, a lot of the time, the basic approach, it just does wonders when it is applied the right way.
Yeah. And I think it reinforces the idea that all of this stuff, these gait assessments, they're meant to give you clues on where to start.
Definitely.
They're meant to give you starting points, but you still have to formulate your drills and assess. And
100%.
Yeah. You're not just looking at someone walk and having the cure necessarily instantly.
Totally.
Right? There's a process.
There's a process. And sometimes you have to play with the drills to see, like, you might find that the person in front of you is expressing that right PMRF pattern, and the first right-sided PMRF activation you use doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Like,
or
there's no change.
Right?
Or it's threatening and makes them worse.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's why we constantly reassess. So it gives us a clue. Yeah, we try to zoom in on it. Then through different training inputs, we're coming up with ideas on history, or based on history and based on other forms of assessments. Then we're constructing drills to try to create a targeted enough drill to then see immediate improvement in this case, gait. And then you got to practice it, right? You got to practice it. And changing the way that somebody walks is one of the greatest things you could possibly do. It really is. I mean, it is really a gold standard for health, because there's so many systems that are integrating together to create gait process, and making somebody more efficient with their movement is a wonderful way to help them eventually get over pain issues too. Because if you're not efficiently locomoting, right, you're not efficiently walking and transferring energy appropriately, that has negative consequences in the long run.
Yeah.
Right. And that's so what we're trying to do is create more efficiency. And then guess what? Walking is the single strongest chronic loading pattern that you can possibly put your body under, which is interesting to think about. But think about how actually we have something called ground force math. I think you'll find this interesting. I was trying to look up like the latest stuff on this because it does change from time to time. Ground force math basically is it helps us understand how much force is actually moving through the body during the walking process. So, and this is the most recent stuff that I came up with, and it's actually it's a little bit different from what I learned only 5 years ago. But basically, what I have here for numbers currently is during walking, you're going to deal with 1.07 to 1.2 times your body weight. So this is during walking. And this is on every heel strike.
Right.
So 1.2 times body weight, your own body weight on every single heel strike.
Now, it's your mass plus the momentum, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And so during running, it's 2 times. It's 2 to 2.9 times body weight on every heel strike. And during sprinting, it's around 4.6 to 5.5 times body weight. Okay. So this gets interesting. So if we take the average male of 200 pounds and let's say that person's average daily step count is 4,774 steps. Okay. We then take 200 pounds. We multiply that by 1.2 times body weight. That's what they're dealing with in terms of force. Okay. And we're going to get 240 pounds. This is on every heel strike during walking. Mm-hmm. And then we take 240 pounds. We multiply that by the average step count, 4,774 steps a day. We now are left with 1 million or 1.145 million pounds that you have to deal with during walking a day. That's insane. Because when's the last time you went to the gym and worked with 1 million pounds? Like even cumulatively, right? It's not going to happen. So just walking 4,774 steps, and hopefully you walk more than that, but I mean, that's like, there's plenty of people getting that many steps, right? When's the last time you went to the gym and worked? Yeah, right. So that's over 1 million pounds of force that has to be transmitted through your body a day. And of course, you could keep going with that math and it would get wild. But this is why such a small problem can become such a big problem in the long run.
Yeah.
Like, oh, my heel hurts a little bit. I hope that's not the start of plantar fasciitis. Okay. And then several years later, maybe it's become more of an issue because you're going under, you're loading your body. So, aggressively. And if you're not transferring that force well, then that's when these little issues start talking to you and become, larger issues down the road.
Yeah. So by improving gait, you are improving sort of the biomechanical
definitely
absorption of force as you're walking, right, through your body. And that can decrease threat over time, which, to your plantar fasciitis point, like maybe that's what it takes to get your body saying, hey, it's okay for you to walk now with no pain.
Yep. And thinking about like that ground force too, and we talked about the back force transmission system and where that energy goes, right? Because that energy has to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And some of it we will reuse, and then the rest of it has to exit. And so a good, efficient gait is being able to reuse energy and allow other parts of that energy to exit the body. I mean, this is why weird things can happen where you have a gait issue at the root, right? And maybe you end up with a TMJ problem, right? Let's say you have left-sided heel pain, right? And you have an energy leak in your gait, and you develop heel problems. And then as force is not transferred as efficiently, eventually your left-sided heel problem turns into a right-sided TMJ problem. Thinking about how energy is
that
transferred
force
through,
is transferring up through your head.
Yeah, maybe it's a right-sided neck problem. In fact, my history, being someone who worked through years and years of sacral iliac problems, Okay. Force transfer was a difficult thing. And I had left sacral issues, and I always had a chronic, it wasn't horrible, but it was always there, a chronic right-sided neck tension right at the base of my skull, right where that force needs to exit. And I had an unstable sacroiliac joint, and then go figure, right-sided neck pain. It's pretty common to see these kinds of things that can happen because of chronic stress, and not being able to move force evenly through the body.
Yeah. Just curious, how is your gait currently?
Well, it's funny you said that.
The state of the gait.
Pretty good. So I'm trying to find an old video. So years ago, when I went to one of my very first courses, neurology courses, we did gait. We were with partners and stuff, and we were going over some gait. And it happened to be a slightly different form of gait assessment, but it's still a video of me walking.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to find that.
Yeah.
Because I really want to see that. Yeah. And I know I have it somewhere because I took a bunch of stuff off on one of my old phones at that point and put it on a drive. And I really want to find that to see, because I know that those were the days where I was really expressing that right-sided PMRF pattern. And it was very obvious, and I'd love to be able to kind of look at that again and then compare it to now, because like one of the things that's improved more than anything else for me posturally is that I used to have that right shoulder that was like super depressed. Like my right shoulder was hanging down, and I would get like kind of almost self-conscious about it when I watched videos of myself teaching, because as I got fatigued from teaching and from like being under the lights and stuff, I would notice that my PMRF pattern would start coming out more and more and more. And I would always see that and be like, man, I really want to fix that. And like early on, I'm like, wasn't totally clear on how I was going to do that. But, just through like a long-term process, that is one of the things that has effectively cleaned itself up so much comparatively to, yeah. So I was missing that upper trap tone. Right. And I also, would get like kind of tight up in that chest area, right? And I just remember that, and I remember foam rolling that to death, just smashing stuff in there and foam rolling that to death, and being like, "Why won't you change?"
Yeah,
and it was all the other stuff I was doing. I think the first thing that started making the biggest impact was I started doing all my mobility work on the left side of my body. That was like the biggest learning experience for me early on, and that kind of catapulted me into an area where then I started getting even better results later on as I was learning more about what to do with my eyes and my vestibular system. But yeah, just like, I don't know, 80% of my mobility work done on my left made some really, really big improvements for me on that right side posture problems that I had.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super cool. I hope you find the video. That would make for a great YouTube also.
Yeah, I know it would.
To analyze it and then analyze your gait today.
Totally.
Yeah. Anything else you want to leave us with about gait?
Well, no, because it'll be a whole nother episode.
I actually have several questions that I've earmarked.
I got so many things on my list here that we didn't even come close to. So there's there's so much stuff. Like, and not in terms of the assessment. I think we did a great job. We did a great job on giving the listeners an idea of what neurologic gait assessment entails. Then the whole idea of training it is a whole nother thing, right? We talked a little bit about that, starting points and everything. That's great, but that's really what we do in our courses, right? Because all of the assessments that we teach people in the courses are giving us, information about those structures we discussed, the cerebellum, the PMRF, the cortex. And so that's the goal, is to take your tools, create your inputs, and direct them at those areas and see if you're getting the functional change that you want.
Yeah, maybe there's a part 2 sometime in the future. We'll see.
Yeah, I think we can come up with something. For sure.
Awesome.
All right, there it is. A little bit on gait assessment, more specifically, neurologic gait assessment. And I hope you guys enjoyed that. Remember, if you are interested in taking your learning to the next level with all of this stuff, we teach this form of gait assessment in the Neuro Dojo. That's our advanced course. But don't just jump to that, because that may be a mistake. We cover so many of the fundamentals in our Foundations Neuro course that are really critical for understanding before you get to the advanced course. Last thing I wanted to leave you guys with is make sure that if you haven't done so already, you are on our email list, because we do have a big surprise coming up shortly. Not going to tell you what it is yet, but if you are interested in learning more about what we do and just taking it to a deeper level, even if you're not quite sure yet if you're going to take our courses at this time, get on our email list, because that is the best way to learn about everything that we have going on. That is it for today. Thank you guys so much for your support on the podcast, and we'll be back soon. Peace out.